find on the screen here remnants from the second requirement that we just walked through, and I'm going to leave those here because I want us to see the difference between the two methods when we're talking about prorating the amount of the overhead that needs to be allocated, and the two different ways to do it. But what I will do, so we're not confused or there's less opportunity for confusion, is I'll highlight yellow the column that we calculated in the last video, which this simply took the percentage of the total each category was before we apply this extra $100,000 until we get rid of it. And so the last method that we're going to look at here says, okay, take this $100,000 over-applied overhead and split it between these three categories, because that's the most logical, the two inventory accounts and the one income statement account. But don't do it simply based on the ending balances that were there, because we might work in a factory that has a high concentration of material costs relative to that show up in the finished costs relative to the work in process. And what that means then is the finished goods inventory has a larger value related to material as opposed to overhead or labor. And so if you simply take the balance, the percentages of a balance of all these items, you're really skewing this ratio, which you could argue isn't the most accurate. So this would be the most accurate way using the proration method, and that would be to take each amount of overhead that was within these numbers here and figure out what those are, and apply the $100,000 based off of that. So in other words, what we've got here in this column is, of this $250,000, we have $72,500, which is manufacturing overhead. The remaining difference is labor and material. Of the 150 in finished goods, 58.5 is overhead. The remaining is material and labor, and so on and so forth. So we're going to take and we're going to say, okay, if this overhead was pushed into these accounts at this ratio, then there's some logic to that, and we should maintain that logical ratio between the three. So here's the new allocation base ratio. You take this amount of overhead that was applied or allocated to each ending balance prior to this extra over or under amount, and you divide it by the total overhead that was applied. Okay, so oops, I just got to format these real quick here. So what that tells us is this is 16%. Let me pull that over a couple more decimals. 15.68%. We do that for all three. Take that amount divided by this. I'm going to do it for the last one as well. Again, we'll run a control total here to make sure these all add up to 100%, which they do. And we're going to say, okay, that $100,000 should be split between these three categories in this proportion. So here's what we did for the requirement number 2. What we're going to do for the third requirement is still get rid of the same 100,000. We're going to split it up differently, right? This work in process is going to get 100,000 times 15.68%. And of course, I've got some rounding errors there, so let me just kill those rounding errors. The finished goods will be this portion, and the cost of goods sold will be that amount. And so you can see it is different, right? I mean, look at the amount that went to work in process was 20,000 up here, and now it's like 15,000. So that we're only talking 100,000 here. If we're talking several $1 million, that is certainly enough to be considered a material amount, which is why this last method would be considered the most appropriate.